I've always believed that some encounters are just meant to be, that they change the course of our lives in ways we can't foresee. My story started in the halls of a busy hospital, where I worked as a nurse on the night shift. It was a typical night, bustling with patients coming in and out, the beeping of monitors, the occasional sound of a gurney rushing through the hallways. And amidst the chaos, there was a little boy who caught my attention. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but he was always hanging around the ER waiting area, sitting alone, his eyes hollow with a kind of sadness I recognized all too well. It was late, maybe around 2 a.m., when I finally got a moment to approach him. He was sitting in one of those uncomfortable blue chairs, staring at the vending machine as if it might magically give him a meal. I knelt down beside him, and he flinched, probably not used to adults showing him any kindness. "Hey there," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "What's your name?" He looked at me, hesitating. "Oliver," he muttered. He had this mop of messy black hair that fell over his eyes, and clothes that were a size too small, as if he'd outgrown them a while ago but didn't have the luxury of new ones. "Are you waiting for someone, Oliver?" I asked, glancing around the waiting area that was empty aside from a snoring security guard. He just shrugged, avoiding eye contact. I figured I wouldn't get much out of him then, so I offered him a granola bar I had stashed in my pocket for long shifts. He took it like it was some kind of rare treasure, ripping open the wrapper and devouring it. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing Oliver more often. He was always there, always alone, and the bags under his eyes made him look older than he should have been. One night, I saw him sleeping on a bench in the hallway, curled up like a stray cat. It broke my heart. I found out through one of the doctors that his mother was battling an addiction, and his father was in and out of jail. There were no relatives willing to take him in, and he was basically fending for himself. It felt like the system had failed him, like it so often does for kids in his situation. One rainy night, when I saw him shivering under a thin jacket outside the hospital doors, I made a decision that changed both of our lives. "You can't stay out here, Oliver. Come on. You're coming home with me tonight," I said, half expecting him to refuse. But he just looked at me with those tired eyes and nodded. It wasn't much of a plan. I hadn't thought through the logistics or the potential consequences, but my instincts told me he needed a safe place, even if just for a while. At first, he barely spoke a word. He stayed in the spare room, his presence so quiet I sometimes forgot he was there. But little by little, he started to open up. He told me about the nights when his mother would disappear for days, leaving him with nothing but dry cereal. He shared how he'd learned to fend for himself, to stay invisible. But he also talked about dreams of becoming something more than what the world had handed him. He was fascinated by the stories I told him about the doctors I worked with, the way they saved lives. One night, as I was helping him with his homework at the kitchen table, he asked me about a word he'd read. "Surgeon." I explained what they did, how they used their hands to fix what was broken inside people's bodies. His eyes lit up with a rare spark, like he'd just discovered something magical. And that's when I realized he wasn't just a kid who needed shelter. He was a kid with potential, with a fire inside him that hadn't been extinguished by the rough hand life had dealt him. The years went by, and I officially became Oliver's guardian. He thrived in school, excelling in science, always asking questions about anatomy and medicine. He spent hours at the library reading about surgeries, flipping through thick textbooks that most kids his age wouldn't touch. I watched him grow from that quiet, uncertain boy into a confident young man with a determination that I couldn't help but admire. He had this fierce drive to prove that his past didn't define him, that he could become something better. When it came time for him to apply to college, he had his sights set on medical school, a dream he'd been nurturing since those late-night conversations at the kitchen table. He got a scholarship, and I couldn't have been prouder. But as much as I believed in him, part of me still worried. The road ahead would be tough, and I knew the weight of his past might be hard to shake. Still, Oliver thrived in med school, just as he had in high school. He called me every week, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask for advice, or to share an interesting case he'd encountered. It was surreal to hear him talk about surgeries and medical procedures with the same enthusiasm he'd had as a kid. I always told him how proud I was, even if he brushed it off with a laugh. But life, as it tends to do, had a way of throwing curveballs. One evening, while I was working a shift at the hospital, I got a call that turned my world upside down. My mother, who had always been my rock, had been diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. I remember standing in the hallway, the phone pressed to my ear, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me. For all the years I'd spent taking care of others, I suddenly felt helpless. Oliver rushed back as soon as he heard the news, despite the grueling demands of his residency. He was there for me in a way I couldn't have imagined when I first met him, a quiet strength, guiding me through the uncertainty of treatments and doctor visits. But as my mother's condition worsened, it became clear that her best chance was a risky surgery that only a few specialists in the country could perform. And as fate would have it, one of those specialists was Oliver himself. He was still a few years into his practice, but he had become one of the most promising surgeons in the country, known for his skill and his compassion. It felt like the universe had come full circle, like every decision, every late-night study session, every act of kindness had led to this moment. Oliver had become the kind of doctor he once dreamed about as a child, but this time, the stakes were deeply personal. He sat down with me one evening in the same kitchen where we'd once talked about his dreams. He looked at me with a seriousness that I hadn't seen in him before. "I'm going to do the surgery, if she agrees. I know it's not easy, but I won't let anything happen to her. I promise." The day of the surgery arrived, and I could barely keep my hands from trembling. My mind kept flashing back to the night I found him, shivering outside the hospital. It was hard to reconcile that memory with the confident surgeon now scrubbing in, preparing to operate on the woman who had been like a grandmother to him. Oliver caught my eye through the observation window before the surgery started, giving me a small, reassuring nod. It was a moment that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of the journey we'd taken together, of the odds he had overcome. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. But finally, Oliver emerged from the operating room, his face exhausted, yet triumphant. "It went well," he said simply, his voice cracking with emotion. I broke down, relief flooding through me. He wrapped me in a hug, and for the first time in a long while, we both allowed ourselves to cry. Recovery wasn't easy, but my mother slowly regained her strength. Every time she saw Oliver, she would reach out for his hand, her eyes brimming with gratitude that words couldn't fully express. And each time, he would give her that same gentle smile, the one that still held traces of the boy I'd met all those years ago. Looking back, I realized that Oliver had saved me as much as I had saved him. Taking him in had been an act of compassion, but it had grown into something so much more, an unbreakable bond, a shared history that tied us together. And when I see him now, standing tall in his scrubs, I can't help but think that life has a strange way of bringing people together, of turning our acts of kindness into something much larger than we ever imagined.